Hiya, this is Maya from Ninja Pools. Have you ever slogged through to the end of a difficult phase, only to realize that the worst is yet to come? Hopefully this video doesn't go that way, but the second half of 2022 definitely did for ESO players. Welcome to part 2 of my 2022 recap, looking back over last year, figuring out what the hell went wrong, but also what went right, and what to work on this year. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, please take a look. I learned a lot making this review, and everyone I've spoken to says there's something in there they didn't know about before. There is a lot of detail, but remember, this is a huge game, a big cash cow for ZeniMax Media, and something that hundreds of thousands of people spend a lot of their time on every week. So I think this level of scrutiny is totally warranted. Also, this year we're getting less content in exchange for the promise of game improvements. And after the backward slide of 2022, we really need to see ZOS deliver. In part 1, we covered hybridization, high IL, great content and bad performance, the relationship between devs and players blowing hot and cold, an insultingly overtuned Mythic, and veteran players starting to leave the game. Nothing to panic about yet, but the fun was just beginning. Our first glimpse of Update 35 was a post from Gina on June 23rd telling us hardware updates were still delayed and teasing the new Battleground weekends. They implemented new tech specifically for these events, so expect them to keep tweaking the formula until it works, but so far it hasn't gone great. 25% extra AP just isn't enough. It goes back to the reward system I talked about in part 1. It's not just trials and dungeons, but PvP too. On June 28th, all the login servers for PC and console all went down. Something we don't see often. I think it was related to an Amazon Prime promotion, but not sure it was ever confirmed. We got the new Zeal of Zenithar event to remind everyone that groups, traders and guilds are a major part of this game. It's a nice idea and probably took much more work than we realized. The second White Strikes Mayhem came on July 18th, and again, great to see Cyril buzzing even on EU. Open World PvP was one of ESO's main selling points when it launched, and still offers something you can't find anywhere else. When it works, anyway. But now, to the dark heart of 2022. July 6th, Gilliam's combat preview for Lost Depths, also known as Update 35. We all remember what happened, so let's skip ahead to why. What made them do it? Quite simply, good intentions, improving accessibility and reining in power creep. These were smart goals approached in the wrong way. If you're a developer who doesn't play ESO, and you keep hearing some customers say the game is too hard, they can't keep up with high APM players, and it's creating division and elitism in your game, well, you can see how you might be tempted to make combat rotations super easy and nerf light attacks because those elite players are good at weaving. You'll close the power gap, solve accessibility, maybe even ease the load on the servers. Brilliant! Okay, maybe it didn't go quite like that, but the point is, it's easy to see how these ideas looked good if you're making high-level changes from a distance. But that's no excuse. They should have looked closer, because the diagnosis was full of holes. First, combat in ESO is hard to understand, not hard to play. It's a knowledge thing. Give these players a decent setup and the knowledge to use it, and suddenly they're cruising through content, regardless of APM. Secondly, light attacks tend to make up a larger proportion of damage for lower tier players, so nerfing them would have made things worse, not better. Finally, homogenized rotations were boring. ESO's combat system is arguably its best asset. Don't kneecap it, and don't try to close the gap by making all the good players quit. That's like getting a flat tire and slashing the other 3 just so your car doesn't tilt. When the patch notes dropped, people freaked out. They didn't care if this was well-meaning ignorance. It looked like contempt for experienced players. And some quit, right away. Data from PTS started pouring in, proving this was a huge misstep. But because ZOS made such big promises about accessibility, some players thought any criticism of Update 35 was just elitism. These arguments got ugly and sometimes stupid. ZOS didn't do it on purpose, but making these promises was irresponsible. We'll skip the rest. If you want a reminder, there's a link in the description to a video I made at the time. To their credit, ZOS realized their mistake and scrambled to rewrite the patch. Gina posted a response on July 29th, admitting the update made less sense in practice than it did on paper. She also promised a Q&A to address the questions surrounding these changes. By the way, we never got this. When the patch arrived, it could have been worse. But it was still a downgrade, and ZOS had shot themselves in the foot. Everyone was demoralized, and this is when players really started heading for the exit. Either once they got the achievements they'd been working on, or when they realized they'd have to re-prog. So many groups and entire guilds were disbanded, and the damage to the devs' credibility was massive. It was also a huge waste of everyone's time. Replacing just one player in a group can be a big deal, and losing progress means you're more likely to lose more players than lose more progress in a vicious circle. Thousands of players on every server had weeks or months of their time wasted by a failed update. Think about that. Sorry to dredge up all those bad memories, guys, but this was the defining event of 2022. Not the awesome zone, trial or dungeons, or the great job with hybridization. It was this. Until recently, ZOS refused to even talk about Update 35, which is telling. But we should never let them get away with that. I understand that the corporate lexicon they like to use makes it harder to talk about mistakes, but then ditch it. Things will go wrong, and a willingness to own it and apologize, if you're smart about it, can build trust and turn a setback to your advantage. I also think if we, the players, show more intelligence in our communication with the devs, ZOS might be more willing to take the plunge on this. Criticism is fine, but abuse is never okay, and there was way too much of it. Update 35 also included Mara's Balm, an astonishingly overtuned set, and yet more proof that the devs need people who have direct experience with the combat system and how it plays, not just a theoretical overview. That would make it easier for them to spot busted sets like this and fix them. We should mention the dungeon DLC itself. I think this was even better than Ascending Tide. Shipwrights is still Dungeon of the Year for me, but Graven Deep comes close. I still squeal like an idiot when dropping down that elevator shaft. And I think Mike Finnegan, the Encounter team, and everyone who worked on the dungeons and Dreadsail Reef deserve huge thanks for making 2022 the best year for group content since I started playing back in 2018. I was sad to hear that we only get 2 dungeons this year, but if that means more time to add detail to story and combat mechanics, it could also be exciting. And from what I've seen on PTS, so far so good. Speaking of Graven Deep, another underrated thing ZOS has been doing for years is their Meet the Character articles. These are always written by an in-game character and sometimes contain lore not mentioned anywhere else. Julev, the Redguard ex-pirate, got a particularly fun one for Lost Depths. It's a letter from one noblewoman to another, and she's nursing a massive lady boner for this Julev guy and really wants to talk about it. Horniest thing I've seen in the Elder Scrolls since the lusty Argonian maid. I was streaming a lore run of these dungeons when we read this, and we were pissing ourselves laughing. I love that the writers take the time to create fun stuff like this for us to find, but I bet a lot of people miss these articles. You can find them on the ESO website or on uesp.net. In September, they introduced a bug, where rezoning would reset your daily endeavors, then a rollback which made players lose gold and progress. And their fix for Mara's Balm targeted the heal instead of a cooldown, fixing nothing. Our first look at Firesong was September 15th with another combat preview from Gilliam. It's great that we got these throughout the year, even when we object to their contents. He never gives us a ton of detail, but he's speaking to the combat system nerds out there and creating a bit of a dialogue, which is great. ZOS recently announced they won't be doing these anymore, apparently because players were too often jumping to conclusions and asking questions that were impossible to answer. We're now going to get a version of this in the patch notes themselves, which seems like a smarter way to do it, to be honest. The Firesong combat preview was a huge relief. No sweeping changes. They finally hybridized Backlash, nerfed Occult Overload, and sorted out Warden after mucking about with it in Lost Depths. It still didn't quite click, but they made some smart changes during PTS, which gave us the new and revamped Frostwarden. Good job, guys! The main feature of PTS was stability. Hiding pets, marking targets, armory stations in PvP, customized actions and housing improvements were added, but we didn't need to do anything. I wish we got that more often. Sometimes the combat system is in a great place and you just want to freeze it for another patch, instead of changing gear and rotation every time. Sos knows this, they've acknowledged it before, and so far, the Scribes of Fate patch doesn't look too disruptive. So, fingers crossed for 2023! Meanwhile, we got the Undaunted celebration and our first Battleground weekend, Chaos Ball! I don't know what Zos's data shows, but it didn't seem like it made much of a splash. I hope they keep working on it. Speaking of chaos, the Firesong launch on November 1st was a hot mess. The combat team must have held up their hands and said, "Hey, don't look at us, we didn't do it this time." It was full of crashes, bugs, login timeouts, ESO Plus subscriptions not recognized. Even porting to the new zone made you crash. In fact, there were so many things that crushed your client that Gina assembled an impressively long list just of confirmed causes and updated it every day as some were fixed while new ones were being discovered. We also got siege equipment not despawning in Cyrodiil, bugged leads, uneditable guild permissions, and Dragonite exploit and the now infamous block bug. Before we get to that, credit to the community managers for the sheer amount of updates we got during this episode. There was a crazy amount going on, and some of it was very specific and technical, but they managed to be transparent and on point. Of course, better to have no issues in the first place, but the way they sprang into action was great. It made us less likely to lose patience and walk away, as some players did earlier in the year. But they couldn't fix the block bug, and this dulled activity for the rest of 2022. For specifics, check out Hyper's YouTube channel. He joked that he was making a new video every week about how Zos broke block. Again. To be fair, in Overland, BGs or Chill Trials it wasn't a big deal, but if you're progging through tough content, if your PvP setup relies on blocking for mitigation, it's a big problem. Some of my groups didn't even bother running. There was almost no point doing no deaths or trifectas since tanks would just randomly die without warning. After sticking with ESO through bad launches, event fiascos, account-wide achievements and update 35, and watching our friends quit, we now found we couldn't play anyway. It was kind of the last straw. More departures, more loss of faith. Rich Lambert responded on November 11th, thanking us for our patience, admitting they dropped the ball, promising to do better, and giving us a free Gua pet. This was met with predictable mockery, but the level of animosity was a bit much. The devs know damn well that a pet is not a fix. It's just an easy way to draw attention to the fact that the creative director himself has posted a mea culpa. It's true that we didn't want a pet, we just wanted the game to work. But the more pointless abuse we throw at the devs, the more we encourage them to stick their heads in the sand whenever things go wrong. And that's the last thing we want. If there was anything to mock, it's the fact that there was no actual apology, as usual. The way they have to bend their statements around the word sorry without actually saying it makes you cringe. Nobody enjoys apologizing, and companies sometimes fret that it carries legal liability, but this is nonsense. It's also lame. It prevents you from saying the thing you need to say. Customers notice this stuff. It was a shitty end to the year, and the fixes were slow. We didn't get a proper incremental patch until 2 weeks after launch, and it did nothing about the block bug. They had to wait until after Thanksgiving. Another patch on December 5th didn't really help because it just replaced one block bug with another. The basic problem was still there. Finally, on December 19th, block was rolled back to how it worked pre-update 36, buying time until a long-term fix could be found. Technically, it is still bugged, but the current bug is much rarer and easier to avoid, and actually seems to have been in the game for most of 2022. A lot of people just didn't notice. But this still means a core gameplay component was broken for 7 weeks, which is 13% of the entire year. I hope I've demonstrated that 2022 wasn't all bad, but the fact that this block bug isn't even the worst thing that happened shows just how bad a year it was. Matt Firor's retrospective letter can't have been easy to write, and I totally understand why he focuses on what's coming in 2023 rather than the year just gone, but their continued silence over Update 35 was deafening. Their Q&A they promised never happened. On December 20th, we got another deep dive about core combat values, which was supposed to be a stand-in for this Q&A, but it's not the same thing. It's like being promised a Hermaeus Mora statue for Christmas and getting a plate of calamari instead. I bet some of the questions they got were awkward as hell or impossible to answer, but this article didn't help anyone. All it did was list a bunch of contradictions. Play the way you want, but don't expect it to always work. Combat should be engaging for elite players, but also easy for noobs. Skillful execution is absolutely crucial. Or you could just equip OConsole. If anything, you feel sorry for the combat team reading this, because some of their goals seem totally irreconcilable. But they'd also be better off with a more plain-speaking approach. Just have the guts to come out and say that some content is supposed to be hard and out of reach unless you optimize and practice. And more importantly, come clean about where that original draft of Update 35 came from. Most players just want to know why this happened, and most importantly, that ZOS aren't going to try it again. That's pretty much all they needed to say. The PTS patch notes for Scribes of Fate do mention Update 35 a bunch of times, and they acknowledge that they made a bit of a mess. And part of Update 37 is cleaning it up. They seem to have realized that APM is not the main problem, but they're still fiddling with light attacks and giving free damage to the players who aren't even looking at the combat system or the patch notes. But it's not going to ruin the game for anyone. We'll see how it goes. Going back to this core combat deep dive, it must have been difficult to write, but there's a lot to be said for straight talking. We're gamers, not auditors, so ditch the management gobbledygook and speak to us like actual people. That's a big one on my personal wishlist for 2023. While all this was going on, we had the New Life event, which repeated the year-long theme of veteran players having nothing to spend all those extra event tickets on, except group repair kits. Bringing back stuff from previous years is cool for new players, who get a treasure trove of collectibles. But do something for the ESO boomers too. Maybe just have the impresario sell Seals of Endeavor in exchange for tickets, or something like that. Then there's always something of value for everyone. Much as the first official communication in 2022 was a Crown Store showcase, the last one of the year was also about a Crown sale. We get it. The Crown Store is an important source of revenue, but come on guys. ZOS could be a lot classier in their handling of this. Anyway, that takes us to the end of the year, and looking back, there are 3 big things which jumped out at me over and over again when putting these videos together. 1. ZOS need to fix the game already. We've put up with embarrassing performance since Greymoor, and it's the #1 reason why people leave the game. Even if the last straw is something else like account-wide achievements or Update 35, performance is what gave them the blues in the first place. Fixing this moves ESO away from the thin ice and closer to solid ground. I'm certain of it. 2. Quality control. Too many things slip through the net, like the blog bug, Mara's Balm Update 35, and even little embarrassing errors like a Greymoor event article talking about explore Eastern Skyrim and complete Sunspire. We've already had some this year. After the awesome Necrom reveal really inflated the hype balloon, they let a silly mount bug steal the spotlight and let some of the air out again. They need to get on this now. It also applies to communication. The players are not always right, but they're not just an inconvenience either. We're the people they can't afford to disappoint. 3. Speaking of which, if we don't want to be treated like an inconvenience, then we need to stop being one. Players need to cut the crap, stop acting like we know everything, and stop letting a handful of enraged keyboard warriors dominate channels like the forums. Let's remind the devs there's a sensible majority out there who mostly keep quiet, but who spent much of last year feeling disappointed and now want to see some results. There's more, but those are the main takeaways for me. ZOS did some superb work in 2022, which set standards for other MMOs to live up to. And it's sad how easily this gets undercut and forgotten, because they screw the pooch in other areas. But that's how it goes, and we really can't afford to have another year like this. I hope you guys found this informative. I learned a lot putting this together. I'm not interested in making clickbait, but videos like this take a ton of work. So if you enjoyed it, please give me a like, a sub, and share it with others. I appreciate it, and I hope that Zos and all of us playing ESO will have a great year in 2023. Thanks for watching!